I had the privilege of meeting a fine young man by the name of David Goodhertz, a rep in Badu's office in Minneapolis. And the first thing I learned about David is that Goodhertz is German for good heart. I'm like, dude, what a cool last name. And David says to me, he says, I feel like I'm a sucker for excuses. I give people a lot of chances. And when I tried to unpack this, I'm like, well, why is that? And he's like, well, I really want to see people win. And my first thought was like, you're living up to your last name. You've got a good heart. You've got a big heart. So I don't think that's such a bad thing that you really want to see other people win. But it may be helpful to surround yourself with some good people to identify some of your blind spots. Like if there's an excuse mentality spilling into the team, I think you need some help discovering the blind spots. So today, we are going to talk about blind spots. So what exactly is a blind spot? Well, a blind spot is something in you that others can see, right? It's clear to other people. They see something in you, but for whatever reason, you're lacking the self-awareness. You're not seeing it in you, right? So the example I always like to use, when you're driving your car, how do you ever find out that you've got a burned out taillight? Well, the answer is usually it's a police officer pulling you over. You're like, oh man, what did I do? Was I speeding? He's like, hey, here's a fix-it ticket. You've got a burned out taillight. So you got 30 days to get it fixed. And so ideally what we want is one of our neighbors, somebody that is close to us, that sees you pulling into your garage and say, hey, Jamie, by the way, saw you pulling in. You've got a burned out taillight. Thank you for saving me being pulled over from the police. Thank you for saving me a fix-it ticket. That's really what a blind spot is. And that's the value of having somebody else point out the blind spot. Years ago, I was at a John Maxwell seminar really for small business owners. I thought this was great. And John encouraged all of us, hey, go back and talk to your teams about your shortcomings. And everybody felt a little weird and awkward about that. Like, gee, I don't want to talk about the things that I'm not good at. And he's like, listen, they already know what your shortcomings are, and they'll be relieved that you know. And it may open the door that they may give you some information on some of these blind spots for you. So that's what a blind spot is. Now let's get into tackling them. So in my mind, I've got 3 things, go figure, 3 things that you can do to discover and tackle blind spots. All right, so here goes. So the first one is ask others. Hey, what do you think my shortcomings are? Now, note that people aren't coming up to you like, hey, Jamie, can I talk to you real quick? Can I talk to you about your shortcomings? Like, people aren't volunteering this information, so you have to ask. And I know I've regurgitated this quote several times in these HEP huddles, and I'm going to do it again. I just really want this to stick. I've memorized this quote. The problem with most of us is that we'd rather be ruined by praise than saved by criticism, by Norman Vincent Peale. And again, first time I heard that, I'm like, is that true? Well, we all love praise. We all love a pat on the back, but saved by criticism? Like, yeah, like you got to seek out the feedback. I was listening to a Joe Rogan podcast, right? So I listened to a lot of his content. I think he's a great interviewer, right? Those 3-hour episodes I think are awesome. And he's, as you know, he's a comedian, right? So Joe Rogan is a comedian. And he's talking about one of the masters, Chris Rock. And he says, Chris Rock, at the end of every stand-up, he meets up with a team of comedians. He's looking for feedback. Because he says, comedy is tricky. I mean, to write a joke, to deliver the joke, and then to have the timing down, like it really is an art. And he's like, Chris Rock is the master, and he's got this team of people he brings around him. He says it takes a lot of courage and humility to admit that you don't have it all figured out. So if one of the greats in comedy, Chris Rock, can admit that he doesn't have it all figured out, I think we can all, myself included. I don't have it all figured out. I have to seek the information, get yourself a team, ask others. My second thought is watch the tape. I believe every NFL team, right? You got the games on Sunday. The first thing they do Monday, like Monday's the work day. We're watching the tape, as grueling as it can be, right? If it's 60 minutes of football, they're spending hours reviewing the tape, rewind, review the tape, rewind. I had the privilege of sitting on a flight one time with Mike Babcock, and at the time, he was the head coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I'm watching him cut videotape, looking at videotape. I mean, this was, I don't know, a 3-hour flight, and he was just glued to the tape. So look at the tape. I remember as a high school basketball player, right? Our basketball coach, Mr. Kevin Greeman, right? I love Kevin Greeman. He's like, he described how to shoot, up through the telephone booth into the cookie jar, right? That was his famous line. And he'd say to me, he says, Jamie, like you're shooting from your chest, you're pushing the ball. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm doing exactly what you're telling me. I'm doing the up through the telephone booth into the cookie jar. And then only when he videotaped my shot did I admit, yeah, I'm shooting from my chest. I mean, he could have told me 1,000 times and I would have argued because it felt like it really felt like I was doing what he's asking me to do. But when I saw it on film, I corrected the shot. I think in today's age, right, everybody's got a phone with a camera, obviously. I mean, I'd be shocked if any of you don't. And we use Zoom quite a bit. So I ask people all the time, if they're struggling with interviews, I'm like, listen, if you're doing a Zoom interview, why don't you record it? Send me the tape. I mean, if you're showing me what you're doing, rather than just talking in general terms, show me the video and I'll do my best to try to correct little things. A lot of times it can be one small little line. I remember way back in the good old days, Mr. Dale Johnson, I'm struggling. Why can't I close? Why can't I get this pitch down? There's something I'm missing, and I didn't know what it was. Dale was the guy, after practice pitching enough times, he says, Jamie, delete the line as you're transitioning to the close. Do you want to go ahead? He says, you don't need to do that. Delete that line. You've already established that there's value for the customer. Delete that line, insert, so let's go ahead and. It was such a small little line and it worked like magic. So watch the tape. And my third and final tip, and this one is part of the self-discovery of the blind spot, is you've got to be discontent with where you're at. Like if you're pleased and you're satisfied with where you're at, it's going to be really difficult. But if you're frustrated, frustration can be a good thing. I remember, talking with my dad way back in the old days, struggling with the field, struggling with everything, the hours I was putting in, it was just struggle. And through that conversation, a light bulb went on where I realized I was loathing in self-pity. And he helped me discover that just by allowing me to talk. He was like a sounding board for me. And I'm kind of like, whoa, like, what am I saying here? Like, poor me, poor Jamie. I'm like, man, I got to eradicate that mentality. Like, let me see what I can do if I can just be, looking at my life like I'm the luckiest man in the world rather than poor Jamie-itis that I was diseased with. And man, I saw an instant turnaround. So it wasn't like my dad told me exactly what my problem was. I discovered it myself, but I was very discontent with where I was at. So I think if you're going through frustration, I think that can be good. Can you turn frustration into something productive? You may discover that blind spot. You may become self-aware, and that can be very powerful. So I hope that helps. David Goodhertz, again, pleasure talking with you, and I will speak to you all soon.